Matthew, here a research fellow. I'm pleased to welcome our guest speaker for the day, Dr. Banu Shene. Dr. Shene is a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at Macquarie University, Sydney. She has extensive research expertise in the areas of migration, transnationalism, and diasporic politics, and is the author of Beyond Turkey's Borders, Long-Distance Kemalism, State Politics, and the Turkish Diaspora, which was published by IB Tauris in 2013. Her current research on Islamic art pedagogies in Istanbul engages with recent debates in anthropology around ethics, self-formation, and Islamic cultural politics in contemporary Turkey. The title of her presentation today is Against Prescription, Exploring Islam in Muslim Music Making in Istanbul. So over to you, Dr. Shene.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, everyone, for coming. It is rather late Friday afternoon. It's a great pleasure to present my research at the National University. I'd like to thank the Middle Eastern Institute and the Department of Malay Studies, and particularly to Professor Farid Alatas for facilitating this talk. The paper I'm presenting today is actually from the last chapter of my book manuscript. It's a work in progress, so any criticisms and feedback would be greatly appreciated. Over the last 5 years, my research in Istanbul has focused on Islamic art pedagogies, in particular on the teaching and learning of the musical tradition, which is known as Sufi music, and of its primary instrument, the ney. This research explores a lifetime of civic servitude or discipline that becoming a skilled practitioner of the ney involves, examining in particular the transformative potential or efficacy of this musical pedagogy to cultivate not only new artistic or musical perceptions, but also new ethical perceptions in learners. I'm particularly interested in looking at the sort of ethical character formation, self-formation processes and experiences that the musical apprenticeship practice and process facilitates. Let me quickly say a few things about the ney itself before I sketch out the plan of the paper. If there is one sound object in the history of modern Turkey with a checkered social life, no doubt it's the ney. It's one of the most beloved instruments of Ottoman music, and particularly of its religious tradition, which is more popularly known as Sufi music. And among all instruments of that particular stream, it has had the most intimate relationship with Sufi orders, or with Islam. The Sufi tarikats, or brotherhoods, were the primary places during the Ottoman period where the ney was performed, taught, and learned by the Sufi dervishes, and also by non-Muslim Ottoman citizens. With the founding of the Turkish Republic in 1923, things start to change quite radically for Ottoman music, and particularly for the sounds, instruments, and repertoires that are affiliated with that musical tradition. In fact, in 1925, the Kemalist nation builders prohibited Sufi orders, and they closed down their lodges, as they also closed down all other pedagogical sites where Ottoman music was taught. These were replaced by new music schools and conservatoriums that were instructing Western music, polyphonic music. In the absence of any official support for the instruction of Ottoman music, note that, in fact, the first conservatorium teaching the ney or Ottoman music in Turkey was opened up in 1976, so not that long time ago. So in that absence of official support, the transmission of this musical tradition could only survive in the hands of individual masters who taught students in their own homes while continuing the learning relationship between master and student. My work in Istanbul takes up the ney's story from the last decade, in which a remarkable revival of the instrument has occurred both globally and in Turkey. So willing students, who are mostly adults, now take lessons in a range of pedagogical sites, from private ney studios, religious associations, university clubs, to local music schools. Ney lessons are available at Istanbul's corporate workplaces as a lunchtime activity. Neys are bought and exchanged as gifts between friends and between partners, while the instrument sound fills an eclectic range of urban spaces, from Sufi tarikats, yoga studios, to hospital wards used for therapeutic purposes. In fact, the Turkish government too, under AK Party, or, under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has been heavily involved in sponsoring Ney teaching. First, through its funding of local mosque organizations under the Ministry of Religious Affairs. Secondly, through funding of its new cultural centers that exist in countries where large numbers of Turkish citizens live. And thirdly, through funding of its these places which we can call adult education centers, which operate under local city councils. In Istanbul alone, for example, there are more than 200 adult education centers, and Ney teaching is by far the most popular activity in these places. More than 5,000 students are enrolled in Ney lessons. So it's in this recent context of Ney thriving Ney thriving in Istanbul that Hezar Fen, a new Islamic art studio, opened up, and was there that I based myself during fieldwork, taking lessons with Ney Zen, means Ney player or Ney artist, Salih Bilgin, for a period of 2 years between 2012 and 2015. Bilgin, whom I will refer to as Salih Hoca, using the Arabic derived Turkish word for master or teacher, is a highly acclaimed master musician who has fostered at least 2 generations of Ney players in Turkey during 20 years of teaching service at the Istanbul Conservatorium. In this paper, I look at one particular aspect of this Islam-infused musical practice, the process by which this learning method transcends mere musical technique in profound ways, entailing a deliberate shaping of the self. In its apprenticeship context, learners receive an education to a mild range of practices that are in many respects extra-musical and which has entailments for both in skilling them in musical knowledge and also for shaping their subjectivities as Muslims. In my book manuscript, I analyze these processes in dialogue with the anthropological literature on skilled learning, particularly those apprenticeship-based studies that have underscored how learning involves becoming a particular kind of person. For example, there's Richard Sennett's book on craftsmen, or Trevor Marchand's work on apprenticeship-style learning based on years of fieldwork with minaret builders in Yemen and with mud masons in Mali, and Alessandro Duranti's fascinating work on becoming a jazz musician. However, in this talk, I'd like to engage with the critical insights on one particular body of anthropological research that has contributed to recent debates in the discipline over ethics and self-making in Islam. This research program crystallizes around the work of Sabah Mahmoud and Charles Hirschkind, who have both written on Islamic revival movements in contemporary Egypt, using the term ethical self-fashioning and drawing on Talal Assad's conception of Islam as discursive tradition. Their work shows how Muslims' engagement with their religion is neither the outcome of blind adherence nor of coercion, but an active process of engagement with ideals of the good life and proper personhood. And even more than 10 years after the publication of these 2 monographs, we still find a flood of publications in the anthropology of Islam that take up and elaborate upon keywords such as piety, ethical self-fashioning, and Islamic discursive tradition. The intervention of this research program has been of crucial importance, both analytically and politically. In a climate of right-wing Islamophobia, it has given anthropologists a vocabulary for sympathetically describing practices such as a turn to religious duties, wailing, attending mosque study groups, or listening to sermons, as well as for analyzing how ethical sensibilities or dispositions are acquired in a Foucauldian sense by means of deliberate bodily practices rather than through individuals following up of some societal rules. However, one problem with this line of study is what I think is its lack of balance. There's a strong tendency in these studies of Islamic discursive tradition to single out a particular mode of Islamic religiosity and register of Islamic discourse, which is legalistic Islam, and to study it as an expression of Islamic orthodoxy. And what concerns me about this framing is the conceptual and empirical implications that it has for our thinking about non-legalistic Islamic discourses that are different to those offered by these partisans of Islam. The Islamic practice that I look at here is precisely of that non-legalistic kind. I begin with an important observation that the Islamic studies scholar Shahab Ahmed makes in his book, What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic, where he notes that in comparison to other social formations, in the study of societies of Muslims, so much value is given and meaning ascribed to the prescriptive and restrictive discourses of Muslims, such as law and creed, and so little value is given and meaning ascribed to explorative and creative discourses. And goes on to argue that when Muslims act and speak exploratively as opposed to prescriptively, they're somehow not seen to be acting or speaking in a manner and register that is representative, expressive, and constitutive of Islam. So by expanding upon Ahmed's useful distinction between prescriptive and explorative discourses, I intend to show how the musical practice at issue here facilitates and values an engagement within Islamic tradition that embraces and valorizes the task of the exploration of meaningful, rather than being concerned with the authorization or prescription of the correct practice. And to do so, I'll selectively focus on two aspects of the pedagogic practice. The first is this use of the verbal practice of sohbet, which we can translate in the first instance as spiritual conversation. I consider in particular the language of conversation, or language of sohbet, and the perceptual modifications it fosters in listeners. And secondly, I'll briefly discuss how the process of learning the ney also involves students in developing a new attitude towards one's environment, which is in this case the city of Istanbul. And I then return to a more theoretical discussion. Okay. Located in one of Istanbul's oldest neighborhoods, the Bosphorus district of Üsküdar, or formerly Scutari, the Hezarfen Ney School is a vibrant arts hub that caters not only for Ney students, but also for learners seeking to master calligraphy and a number of other Islamic visual arts. Salih Hoca's choice of Üsküdar as a place for the studio was not arbitrary. In his sacred geography, Üsküdar was important because some of the key members of his lineage had also lived in this particular part of the city, including his own master Niyazi Sayın, who continues to live there today and who regularly visited the Ney studio. And Sayın has been acclaimed with the highest honorific title in Sufi art traditions, the Pole of the Ney, Kutbinai. Salih Hoca describes Üsküdar as a spiritual, maneviyatlı neighborhood, since it has been home to more than 100 Sufi tekkes from the Ottoman period, as well as housing the tombs of many well-known Sufi saints, whom he used to refer to as the real Neys of Üsküdar. Salih Hoca was an unusual master in some respects. On principle, he never gave individual lessons. His communal lessons catered for roughly 10 to 15 students at a time, and there was no attempt to demarcate students according to their level of proficiency. So both a newcomer and someone who had been exposed to lessons, say, for 10 years would be pretty much sitting next to each other, as often occurred. To my biggest surprise, there was no expectation that every student would play in each and every lesson. In fact, during the whole time I spent at the studio, including the very last 2 months that I spent in Istanbul, some of my fellow learners rarely brought their neys to the class, and yet they were diligent in not missing a single lesson, as they also attended the classes of other groups held on other evenings of the week. The best lesson is the one when hardly any playing happens, I was told by the old-timers. Salih Hoca was not only a musician acclaimed for his artistic talent, but he was also well-versed in the art of speech-making, a skill that he had mastered through his own lessons with Neyzan Niyazi Sayın, and also through his long exposure to the sohbet events or sohbet gatherings of the Cerrahi Sufi Tarika in Istanbul. So in essentially Sufi disciplinary practice or pedagogical practice, sohbet has a long-standing force in Islam. Minimally, it denotes a spiritual conversation between a sheikh or murid and disciples. Keeping the company of the sheikh, sitting down near him and receiving his words directly from his mouth are all valued as a key medium for the moral transformation of the disciple. Sufis valued this discipline of presence so much so that they describe it against orthodoxy as the greatest namaz, which cannot be made up later. Unlike in the case of namaz, which is, as you know, the ritual prayer and a core pillar of Islam, sohbet, if missed, cannot be caught up at another time. So there is timeliness to an effective sohbet. It emerges when the mood of the moment is right. And given that Sufi orders were historically the key hubs for the performance and teaching of Islamic music, it's no surprise that some of the pedagogical methods used by the Sufis, like sohbet, have made their way into contemporary Islamic art education. At Salih Hoca's studio, Ney teaching happened in sohbet. So basically there were two types of sohbet events. There were periodically held sohbets, which will be delivered by another musician or respected craftsperson invited to give a sohbet, which were sort of monthly held events. Sorry, not jump. But I'm sort of more talking about here the sohbets that occurred in the lessons, or the lessons which occurred in the sohbets, which are sort of completely unplanned verbal or discursive speech acts, and they're completely tied into the musical or technical content of the lessons. So the conversation would arise spontaneously in the flow of the lesson when the time is right. Sometimes a comment about the Ney's fingering would escalate into a comment about living in chaotic Istanbul. At other times, an anecdotal story of a Sufi master would foreground a certain dimension of the musical knowledge for those who had ears to hear. So these back and forth movements between the techniques or the artistic side of music and various dimensions of social life happened all the time and in a very natural way. Okay, before I give some examples of sohbet narratives from my lessons with Salih Hoca, let me note here that a major problem of translation arises when I select a chunk of words from what was originally a very long speech act that could be going on for 2 hours and even sometimes more, and abstract them from their pedagogic and performative context, including the speaker's qualities of voice, his skillful use of silences, and the listening skills of the audience, who in their own attentive and participant interpretation are also authors of an emergent narrative. So I'm unable to give you the full flavor of these speech performances. Okay, let me proceed with an example. On one occasion, Salih Hoca cuts my playing short, pointing out that I wasn't getting the right tonal relationships between some of my notes. Of course, all musicians in any musical genre need to cultivate an ability to hear the correct pitch. But this is extra hard in Ney playing for several reasons. First, because the Ney is made of reed. It has no machine-like accuracy, unlike, say, the piano. No two reeds are ever the same. Each Ney comes with certain faults and idiosyncrasies that need to be worked out or discovered by the player so that they can adjust their bodily actions and posture accordingly in order to correct the pitch errors. So the player is the one who is made to submit their will to the authority of the Ney, not the other way around. And secondly, Ottoman Turkish music system use a lot of microtones, a bit similar to Indian music, for example. Microtones take a lot of effort to learn to discern or hear. So the classical Western music, for example, only has whole tones and half tones. It divides the interval or the distance between, say, C and D in half. But there are smaller intervals discerned between those two notes in Ottoman Turkish music system. So this is how the musical or technical instruction unfolds following my unsatisfying playing, and then sort of turns into a long speech act, which pretty much actually continued until the very end of the lesson. Right? Okay, it's a bit long. Think of each note as a zone, and music making as a way of creating relationships between those zones. The essential thing to grasp is each note's relationship to another. If you compose those relationships well, then music emerges. Now, there's always a distance between any two notes. Music theory calls that distance interval, but if you think of that distance as interval, we will never become freed from the rules of theory. If we treat that distance as relationship, then we might be able to search for the spiritual relationships between sounds. Isn't music a spiritual relationship between any two notes? And just like notes, we too have a relationship with one another. Distances, relationships matter in every sphere of our lives. There is at least one key similarity between the world of sounds and of human beings. Managing both entails skillful judgment of the right distance between any two notes or between any two selves. If we work out those relationships well, we live a life composed of good melodies. And the speech event continued thereafter until the end of the lesson, finishing in the last half an hour of that time on a final note on the importance of repetition or repetitive practice or riyaz in musical learning. So it continues. Just prior to his death, saintly Ibn Arabi said, "If I hadn't performed my namaz over the last year, what state would I be in?" Now, saintly Arabi died at the age of 95 and had made his prayers since he was 7. Yet he still said, "What state would I be in?" We need repetition to experience that one complete namaz to achieve that right relationship between any two notes. One salient feature of the spoken language here is its use of metaphors and analogies to generate understanding. So an artistic principle comes to be imagined in the form of repetition of namaz. The sonic relationship between two notes is likened to an intersubjective relationship between two cells. Speech delivers its message by suggesting possible resemblances between different situations, and thus so by fashioning multiple possibilities of meaning. And because the speech acts I'm looking at here were almost always couched in such metaphoric and poetic language, I'm going to talk a little bit about metaphors and how they serve as vital scaffolding tools. Analysts saw metaphor treated in two ways. The physicist Max Planck thought that metaphors, like the rosy-fingered dawn, create a whole which is greater than the sum of its part, something complete in itself, a stable compound. The philosopher Donald Davison is somewhat unhappy about this way of understanding metaphors. To him, metaphors are more like processes fashioned from words. The point here is that they roll forward and sideways, allowing one to touch on further meanings. Metaphors and analogies are not merely illustrating ornaments, but they're vital creative devices of meaning-making in discursive exchange, allowing words to go beyond a single level of meaning that can potentially generate complex meanings beyond the literal limitations of formal definitions. As Shahab Ahmed puts it, in metaphor, words are able to say something other than what they mean, or mean something other than what they say. They're able to reach beyond themselves. Okay, let me give another example. In lessons, Salih Hoca conveyed the same instructions many times, over and over again, yet the same message always came in the shape of a new analogy or metaphor. The following narratives from two separate lesson occasions communicate exactly the same message, which is the importance of good sound, getting a good sound, a proper sound from the ney, yet through different metaphoric pathways. Okay, so he goes, the real ney is this ney, friends, pointing at his own body. This ney, the ney in his hand, is a symbol. We should aim to get a good sound from this ney so that this ney also sounds good. Achieving a beautiful sound is a precious thing. Just because there's a real neyzan, ney player who blows into the human ney, and neyzan who plays us. I breathed life into you, and now you breathe life into the things I said, says that neyzan to us. So we should speak good things and carry out good works. And if we are playing this instrument, we must also do it well. We must get a good sound out of the ney. Okay, so on another occasion, again, the same message comes in a slightly different way. Here our goal is to make a good sound on the ney. We should continue to work on this even if the day of judgment was to come tomorrow. There's a hadith, as you know, even if the end of time is upon you and you have a seedling in your hand, plant it, the Prophet said. The intention here is certainly not to replanting in and of itself. Whatever you are doing, you should continue doing it until the end and do it the best you can. For instance, if your job is to make a ney, you should strive to make a better ney, and you must make sure that none of the neys you make are identical with each other. Are we identical? In manyness I found oneness. Who said these words? One of the talibas replies here, Niyazi Misri. Only from multiplicity can oneness emerge. So each one of these speech acts foregrounds and backgrounds, if you want to use the phenomenological language here, particular aspects of the same message, affording listeners a new perspective or a new experience in pursuing its meaning and force. In the first speech act, the virtue of establishing a good sound gains its meaning or meanings from the analogous relationships drawn out between the instrument ney and the human ney, and secondly between the human neyzan and the true neyzan. Just as the neyzan, the human neyzan, blows breath into the ney, the essence blows life into the human ney. And the analogy then equates getting a beautiful sound from the instrument with getting a good sound from life. In the second example, the spoken language moves from the known to the unknown in a slightly different manner, this time by crossing back and forth between sound work and other practices that one labors on it in life. The perfecting of each requires commitment and persistence and doing the best one can do today. One meaning accrues to another. The language demands from listeners a new exploration of meaning through its interrelating of the uniqueness of each ney and of the uniqueness of each divine creation. Their perceived likeness seems to emerge here. Just as divine creation sets out an example for making a good ney, the material world itself stands as a metaphor for the former, the divinity, we could say. Here the speech does no more than express the fundamental Sufi idea that all things in the material world are the manifestations of the essence. The seen world we live in is itself a metaphorical representation of the unseen. So Salih Hoca's reciting of the poetic line by the 17th century Sufi Niyazi Misri, in manyness I found oneness, only makes sense in relation to this thought. It alludes to the core Sufi concepts of oneness of being, or tawhid, and unity of existence, wahdedi vücud. As Salim Kamal notes, the metaphor is ambiguous, not in having no clear meaning at all, but is rather polyvalent in the sense of having a set of possible meanings. It's precisely the semantic capacity of the metaphor that allows speech to express a complex meaning or complexities of meanings, in this case, perhaps complexity of revelation of Islam, in an explorative mode. And it's precisely this semantic capacity of the metaphor that makes it the best suited tool for the pedagogy of sohbet. The value attributed to sohbet in societies of Muslims lies at least in two things. First, in the conditions of face-to-face, intimate listening context that this discipline of presence facilitates, and secondly, in the semantic capacity of its deeply metaphoric language, by means of which the knowledge or instructions can be communicated in an explorative mode. So the aim of this verbal event is not to determine or prescribe the meaning of truth, but to foster a multidimensional exploration of meanings, plural, and it strives to do that by retaining, exploring, expressing, and communicating the complexity, the polymetry, and polyvalency of truth. So sohbet cannot accomplish its task without the aid of these language tools. And of course, as phenomenology reminds us, one might always extract from the metaphor a different meaning according to one's own present concerns. In the process of comprehending the statement, in some sense, I reconstruct the event that is described, and I do so by bringing to bear a great deal of what I already know, not just about language, but also about the world. What I invoke is largely experiential, perceptual, and cognitive, and probably almost never identical to what others might understand from the same speech act. In this sense, the process of meaning-making is largely mediated by our horizons of the past. Yet over time, listeners can also come to cohere around the possibilities of meanings that similar speech acts invoke in them. Over time, there's an always emerging alignment of meanings between the speaker and the trained listener, which is something I discovered through my own learning of the ney, through sohbet. Through exposure to listening, one can begin to give new insights and perspectives to speech and start to address the skilled practice and the world in new ways. And this perceptual modification is an ethical modification. Okay, Salih Hoca's lessons would bring a rich repertoire of extra musical practices into relationship with becoming an ezan. It doesn't matter whether you're a man or woman, an ezan should know how to cook well. You cannot blow the ney if your eye is oblivious to the calligraphy written on the fountain in the Üsküdar Square. So Turkey had changed the script, as you might know, in 1925 from the Arabic script to Latin script, so not everyone can understand, what all this nicely inscribed calligraphic writings all around the city mean. And Neyzan should know where to find the best coffee in the city. On other occasions, certain places in Istanbul will be the focus of his instruction. If you want to become an ezan, you should go to Eyüp and walk around its old streets. An ezan should make the time to go to Beyazıt and visit the second-hand booksellers there. If you want to learn the ney, it's good for you to go and sit in the courtyard of the Mevlevi Sufi Dergah in Galata. So for Salih Hoca, the road to becoming an ezan went through these activities and not just through playing the ney. We needed to be nourished by these places. And these activities and places didn't only exist in his talk. He did all of these things with his students. Cooking, for example, was something he was particularly strict about. In fact, a kitchen, I think that's the next slide, a kitchen was integrated into the studio, and it was a major activity that students participated in a country where I think not many sort of cooking is often reserved for women. This is in itself an important ethical modification for male students. He also fostered for students an experiential engagement with certain places in Istanbul's landscape. Wrong order. Second-hand markets and trade shop in the neighborhoods of Tahtakale and Karaköy formed one cluster of places we often visited. Participation in such place-based activities facilitated in students an embodied know-how about where to find in Istanbul a certain object, a certain craftwork, or even a certain food, about how to discern the quality or value of that thing and how to appreciate the skilled labor that goes into the making of a certain thing, i.e. of good craftsmanship. These activities also cultivated in serious learners new urban competencies that involved learning how to talk, not to anonymous people, but say to a merchant or a craftsman, how to bargain. And becoming a skillful bargainer implies here a form of entering into a gift exchange, into a building up a reciprocal relationship in a neoliberal city which is full of shopping malls, and as well as becoming an actor in certain circuits of trade and skill. The old city with its Ottoman mosques and tombs and Sufi lodges were also objects of this placemaking in the city, an aspect of creating Muslim spaces in the city. In heterogeneous contemporary Istanbul, these places are not part of a mold in which Muslim lives are naively shaped, but instead they become chosen points of reflection, poetic references. Inhabiting the city in a Muslim way, Henkel writes, is affected by foregrounding certain sites and backgrounding others by designating certain elements as significant and others as unimportant, and by visiting felicitous Muslim spaces. The intentional modifications fostered in becoming a skilled practitioner of the ney also involved in a new attitude towards the city, or towards one's urban environment. The places that Salih Hoca's spoken words expressed and described did not constitute an unconscious part of learners' experience of the city. Rather, in being spoken for and in being visited, these places are deliberately brought to the attention of learners, disclosed as something to be inhabited or noticed. In his work on political activism in Istanbul, Christopher Houston argues that this constitution of a new attitude towards the city involves an ethical education of political activists, the cultivation in them of an ethical sensibility that will notice or infer particular aspects of the urban environment, say poverty or injustice and inequality, at least for the leftist activists that he worked with, and to be moved by certain dimensions of people's lives. So there's an ethical dimension or particularity in perception. So to reckon with the city in new ways and to pursue it against the grain of its constitution by capitalists or nationalists and their embedded intentions in the urban environment should be seen as a vital entailment of the perceptual modification or subjectivity formation that learners experience. One fellow student explained how, since coming to the studio, she had developed a new liking for discovering Istanbul's Sufi sites as well as those in other cities. I went to Bursa the other weekend and didn't leave a single tomb, a single tekke unvisited there, she remarked, pointing out how such places had not been a particular focus of her intention in the past. The spatial practices that the studio sponsored for students too sometimes extended beyond Istanbul. In one occasion, upon finding out that one of the apprentices had not yet visited the tomb of saintly Mevlana Celaleddin Rumi, a plane ticket was immediately arranged to send the young man to the city of Konya in the middle of Anatolia. In the following autobiographical insight, one of the senior students of Salih Hoca recounts what was it like to learn from him. So he says, it was in 1995 when I became... 5 minutes? Oh, wow. 7, okay. I became a talebe to Salih Hoca at the conservatorium. Even his conservatorium class was like a Sufi tekke in those days. There was always sohbet. Some of us would also go to his Üsküdar home once a week. In the first 6 lessons, I can't remember taking my name out of its bag even once. He will teach us how to make ebru, which is water marbling, how to use the laughing machine to make the nail mouthpiece. We would cook, repair all the objects that we would collect from second-hand markets. Much later, I understood that I was learning the nail all that time. I wasn't actually having a nail lesson, but I was learning to become a nailzan. Okay, I have to move a bit faster. And sort of in the final part of the paper, just want to discuss more explicitly how this music making relates to Islam. And it's an important question, not because clearly there's a relationship between them, but because when the study of disciplinary projects engaged by Muslims is foregrounded, the scope of religious expression seems to be limited to legalistic modes of Islamic discursive tradition. So, in fact, in the anthropology of Islam, recently there have been a lot of debates, discussions about whether there is too much Islam in the anthropology of Islam or too much or too less Islam in the anthropology of Islam. Mittermeier, for example, argued that there is too little Islam in the anthropology of Islam, which is the line of argument that I'm following, but I've got different reasons for arguing so. I think that anthropology's engagement with the study of Muslim piety and ethics has become increasingly characterized by the privileging of, again, one particular form of Islam, which is oriented towards its legal traditions. For example, in Mahmoud's and Hirschkind's studies on mosque study groups and on sermon listening of Egyptian man, respectively, there's an overwhelming interest in the legal interpretation of Islamic scriptures, which is fine, but then when it comes to defining orthodoxy, they seem to readily accept the categories used by their Islamist interlocutors. So when the piety and Islamic discursive tradition research program is of concern, I think attention mostly goes to prescriptive projects of Islam. Okay, what does that mean? So we have to go back to Talal Assad's definition of discursive tradition back in his seminal 1986 lecture, where he said, if one wants to write an anthropology of Islam, one should begin, as Muslims do, from the concept of a discursive tradition that includes and relates itself to the founding texts of the Quran and the Hadith. A tradition consists essentially of discourses that seek to instruct practitioners regarding the correct form and purpose of a given practice that precisely because it's established has a history. So according to Assad, a practice is Islamic because it's authorized by the discursive traditions of Islam and is taught to Muslims, end of quote. So this formulation is by definition about prescription and authorization. What Assad proposes as a suitable theoretical beginning to study Islam is the prescriptive discourses of Islamic orthodoxy that is into instructing, regulating, authorizing, and prescribing the correct. And as Ahmed writes, one implication of this conceptualization is that authoritative, prescriptive, and exclusivist discourse by definition, comes to be seen as more Islamic than non-authoritative, non-exclusivist discourse and reasoning. Can we not conceive of other forms of authority in Islam, he asks, that not only are not prescriptive, but are actually at odds with prescriptive authority? Ahmed's question is instructive here because the discourses and practices that are constitutive of the ethos of the community of practice that I'm discussing here are precisely of that non-authoritative, non-prescriptive, and non-orthodoxizing kind. Here, the discursive tradition is not concerned with instructing Muslims in what is correct or with condemning the incorrect. Instead, is oriented towards a project of exploration. So it doesn't seek to prescribe a single meaning as Islam or Orthodox Islam. Rather, it explores a range of possible meanings as Islam and is prepared to leave those meanings both unsettled and unsettling. And again, this is where the metaphors and the language of sohbet comes in. Further, while this Islamic musical pedagogy both inskills learners in musical knowledge and shapes their subjectivities as Muslims through a range of practices, neither of these prospective processes or ends is given primacy over the other, nor for that matter is one reduced to the other. In fact, the intricate confluence of music and Islam can be likened to a relationship of analogy. So each helps explore meaning about the other to explore the meaningful. And this is not the case with many disciplinary practices that anthropological research identifies as being Islamic, where we see a clear priority being given to the religious aspect of those practices. So in Winiger's work, again in contemporary Egypt, we see that art traditions either come to be seen as a tool for inculcating Muslims into a Islamic ummah, or sometimes there's a tendency to deem them as haram, like we see in Hirschkind's work, where his Muslim interlocutors often refer to Sufi music or any music as being non-Quranic and for being non-Islamic. So I guess the more productive question to ask here is then, what makes music being heard as un-Islamic and even haram, forbidden in one particular place and time, or is the means for reaching God in another? I think I'm running out of time. 2 minutes, okay. And one answer lies, as Assad notes, in identifying the dynamics and relations of power that are operative in a given Islamic context. And to be sure, this is exactly what Sabah Mahmoud sets out to do in The Politics of Piety, but the relations of power that she's interested in deconstructing is the one between Islam on the one hand and what she calls the secular liberal politics on the other. And to me, her critiquing of the West's inability to understand what kind of moral subjectivity is at stake for those Muslims is important, but the anti-music or anti-Sufi bias of these born-again Muslims studied by Mahmoud and Hirschkind are directed against other forms of possible Islams in Egypt, not against the West or the liberal feminists. So to me, the polemical distinction that she establishes between Islamism and so-called secular liberal politics or feminism prevents her analysis from engaging with the contested varieties of local Egyptian Islams on their own terms. In present-day Turkey too, Islamist movements similar to those in Egypt exist, and their prescriptive claims about music are common. How do those who are dedicated to the project of Islamic music pedagogy respond to them? So I'll finish off with a quote from, again, one of my from our lessons, when one of the students mentioned a debate he stumbled upon, a music web blog site. The topic of the debate was whether it was sinful, günah, to play the ney before doing ablutions. Salih Hoca guffawed for a moment and then responded, "We're not that type of Muslims. Here the issue is from which perspective one looks at music. What we see in music from the window we look at it is a vehicle that helps one travel to God. The paths to God are many. You can travel to God by bus, by bicycle, or on foot. But some vehicles are so powerful that they can help one traverse that distance in the fastest way, like muhabbet, like music." And to me, this response is striking. First of all, it's a non-exclusivist statement that it recognizes in the first place a multiplicity of ways of being and living as a Muslim. It doesn't take a position to claim that one of these ways is more Islamic than others. it posits a particularly clear self-definition about the self. That is to say that we are not that type of Muslim is to pronounce at the very same time that we too are Muslims, but of another sort. Because the discourse here is not governed by an urge to recommend one particular form of authority as being somehow more standard or orthodox than others in terms of Islam, it's also a non-orthodoxizing statement at its best. Nor is it driven by an intention to prescribe which mode of religiosity ought to be chosen over another. And fourthly, while it's a non-prescriptive and non-orthodoxizing statement, its discourse posits its own normative values about living as a Muslim in claiming that vehicles such as music and muhabbet are especially forceful in enabling one to travel to God. Okay, I think I have to move to my last page. Okay. So the point I'm trying to make here is that to failure to recognize explorative discourses of this kind as Islamic, also, at least in my own discipline, when anthropology of Islam has been of concern again when I look at the sort of stream of publications that have come out in the last 10 years, the failure to recognize such explorative discourses as Islamic also prevents us from recognizing the really existing liberality in Islam. Here I use the word liberal in the literal sense of the word to mean munificence, which implies a willingness to accept the validity of lives and practices, religious or otherwise, of those different from one's own. The statement, "we are not that type of Muslim," epitomizes such liberalism, for it recognizes the Muslimness of those who pursue paths different from its own, even as it calmly asserts its own path to be legitimate and orthodox. So in conclusion, in grappling with the different ethical formation of Muslims, we encounter both idealized understandings and messy practices. Sometimes we learn about autonomous Egyptian Muslims that constitute themselves as pious subjects against Egyptian state Islam, and liberal Muslim musicians that value the act of dependency upon others, including God. An anthropology of Islam that orients itself to the rich everyday lives of Muslims in their particular social historical context must find simplistic the intellectualism of self-affirming theories of Western and Muslim difference. By contrast, even as it studies how local Muslims adopt, appropriate, or reject the ideological positions of intellectuals, anthropology must orient itself to ethnographic interpretation of the ways in which the people it studies shape their worlds on their own terms. Okay, so I'll stop at this point, I think.
To Shanae.